Now we're going to talk about the basic anatomy of the mature musculoskeletal system. And again, this is not an anatomy course. You don't need to memorize it all. It's just helpful, I think, to understand where we're going when we're talking about embryologic development. So we'll start with the skeletal system. So your skeletal system is composed of both bones and cartilage. There are many different types of bones described by their shape: flat, irregular, long, short, sesamoid. But the long and the short bones are the ones that we speak a lot about, particularly in embryology, in addition to the vertebrae, which are irregular. The long bones are very important in prenatal diagnosis because measurement of the long bones can be a clue to growth of the baby and whether or not there might be abnormal growth in process. The skeletal system, of course, has many functions. It provides support for the body, it allows for movement, it's protection for the internal structures. The bone marrow contained within some bones produces red blood cells, and it is a mineral reserve. So you can actually break down bone if you are in need of a certain mineral. Now, the human body has about 270 bones at birth, but only 206 at skeletal maturity. All right? And the reason for that is that over time, some of your bones are fusing together. And this process occurs not just shortly after birth, but over the course of your childhood and young adulthood. And the best example of this would be the skull. So we see a fetal skull and an adult skull. The fetal skull clearly has many more bones within it, and then correspondingly these sort of empty spaces, which are called sutures or fontanelles, in between those bone plates. Now that allows for the skull of the baby to mold as it passes through the birth canal, making it possible for the baby to exit the mother. But of course you don't want all of that flexibility for the rest of your life. You'd like to have a solid brain case that will protect the brain. So those initial fontanelles and sutures allow for the safe delivery of the baby vaginally and for the growth and development of the brain, but they do close over time. And the fontanelle you may be familiar with, if you're not familiar with this already, is the baby soft spot. So if you're holding a very young baby, you can feel at the top of the head a place where you can actually push down a little bit, although of course you should not, on the skin of the baby because there's no bone underneath. And that's the anterior fontanelle where several of those skull plates come together. Now what happens if we get premature fusion of a cranial suture? Well, there are any number of syndromes that are characterized by what's called craniosynostosis, which is fusion of those cranial sutures before their time. So we'll just look quickly at one example. This is Apert syndrome. So this child has Apert syndrome. It's a dominant condition, although often it is a new mutation in a family. So a baby that acquired the mutation in one egg, in the egg or the sperm that went on to form the baby, and not something that was inherited. It's caused by mutations in the FGFR2 gene, not the last FGFR gene. We'll talk about this week. Now, normally, the function of this gene, among other things, is to trigger cells to become bone. Okay, so this is a cell signaling molecule. This is a cell receptor molecule, but activation of this receptor triggers the formation of bone. Now, when it's functioning abnormally, in the case of Apert syndrome, what you get is overactivity. So we have excess bone forming, and so we get early fusion of that suture. And in this case, it's the coronal suture. So this is coronal craniosynostosis, and I've highlighted the coronal suture here. So if you can imagine, if you had premature fusion of the suture that sort of runs across the top of your head and down the side, sort of in front of your ears, then your brain would not be able to expand from back to front the way it's supposed to. So in fact, it would have to grow up instead because those sutures are still open. And that's what you can see in the picture of this little one here, whose head is rather tall and kind of short front to back. In addition, you get fusion of the digits, both the hands and the feet, with this particular condition. Many kids with this will have intellectual disability, although not all of them. Hyperhidrosis, excessive sweating, and they tend to develop severe acne as teenagers. But it's interesting, this abnormal fusion, this abnormal growth of bone occurs not only in the skull, but also in the hands and the feet. All right. So other divisions of the skeleton. So you have an axial and an appendicular skeleton. Your axial skeleton contains your skull, your vertebral column, so your spine, your sternum, which is your breastbone, and then your ribs. And the appendicular skeleton is basically your limbs and all the bones that would attach your limbs to the axial skeleton. Okay, so your scapulae, which are your shoulder bones, are your shoulder blades, clavicles, which run sort of right below your neck, across your chest, and your pelvic girdle. Now, we're not going to go through the anatomy of all the different types of bone, but I did want to highlight one of them because this is one that's mirrored in the embryology textbook. So we'll talk a little bit about the long bones. Now, in general, the exterior of a bone is composed of compact bone and cartilage, particularly at the joints. The cartilage helps reduce friction and acts as a little bit of a shock absorber, so it's very helpful at joints. You get blood vessels, you get nerves, you get muscles. The interior of a bone is bone marrow in the case of long bones, blood vessels and nerves as well. Now the long bone is divided into several sections. At either end you have the epiphyses, which are highlighted here in green, at both proximal and distal ends. They contain spongy bone and red bone marrow, which is responsible for making red blood cells, platelets, and white blood cells. And then the long part, the shaft of the bone, is called the diaphysis, contains yellow bone marrow. And then in the middle, or in between the diaphysis and the epiphyses, at either end you have a metaphysis, which contains the epiphyseal plate. And this is important because the epiphyseal plate is cartilage, and it is where you get new bone growth as you age, okay? And ultimately where eventually all the cartilage does turn into bone and you stop growing most of the time. And so what you have is this epiphyseal plate, which is composed of cartilage, but once bone growth stops, you see what's called the epiphyseal line, which is highlighted here. And that's one way you can actually age a skeleton. If you're looking at it, you can look at the long bones for the presence of the epiphyseal line. And if you see it there, you can sort of guesstimate age based on the fact that that person has completed their bone growth. All right, different types of cells of the bone. So in reality, the cells of the bone are a minority of its volume. Most of it is composed of collagen and minerals and other kinds of materials. But there are many different kinds of bone cells. The ones we'll talk about are osteoblasts, osteocytes, osteogenic cells, and osteoclasts. We'll start with osteogenic cells. So those are the bone cells that are essentially the stem cells. So they're the only cells within your bone that are actively dividing. Osteoblasts are the cells that are forming new bone, and they're secreting collagen and calcium salts. And as they secrete collagen and calcium salts, they become locked inside the bone they're forming and transform into osteocytes, which provide maintenance for the bone tissue. And then the last cell types are the osteoclasts. Osteoclasts break down old bone, in part because bone is sort of undergoing constant remodeling over the course of your lifetime, but it also allows for the release of stored minerals. And so we talked about the skeleton as a mineral reserve. This is one way you can actually access those reserves. All right, on to muscles. Again, we're not going to go through all the different muscle types in great detail. I just want you to understand basic structure so we can talk about how they develop. And we'll focus on skeletal muscle because that one is, again, the one that's highlighted to some degree in your embryology book. But the key here with skeletal muscle is that it's this sort of complex arrangement of nested bundles of muscle fibers. And the diagram here is showing the muscle sort of at the top at its most complex as a complete muscle, and then broken down into different sections or sort of highlights of each of these bundles until you get all the way down to the sarcomere and the actual contractile unit of the muscle, which contains both actin and myosin, which are filaments that are involved in contracting. Now, the skeletal muscles are only associated with the skeleton, so these are not muscles, say, in the heart or the internal organs, and they really only respond to input from neurons. So these are not muscles that would respond to hormonal changes or other kinds of stimuli. There are also cardiac muscles and smooth muscles. Cardiac muscle, as you might expect, is really only found in the heart, It does respond to stimuli from neurons, but also from hormones and other kinds of triggers, which would make sense. You probably noticed you have a faster heartbeat when you're experiencing fear, which triggers a hormonal response. Now, all of your heart muscles are in fact connected. The heart is in fact a muscle in and of itself, and they are all connected such that they can contract as a single unit, which is important. You don't want part of your heart to contract at one time and the rest to contract at another. So the heart is actually a very interesting muscle that we're going to talk about in an entirely different week. This is just basics. For the smooth muscle, that's what you see in your skin. So we talked about those erector pili muscles that control the hairs. You see them in your blood vessels and in your internal organs. So we talked a little bit about Hirschsprung disease and the intestinal system. Those are smooth muscles. They respond again to neurons, but also to other stimuli. Another way we can talk about muscles is based on their appearance under a microscope, and so that gets us to the idea of striated versus non-striated muscles. Striation refers to the organization of the actin and myosin filaments. Are they highly organized in these striated patterns? In the case of skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, they are. Or are they sort of loosely arranged, not following any particular straight line, in which case they're called smooth or non-striated muscles. Again, your skeletal muscles are associated with your skeleton, your bones. Cardiac muscles are in the heart, and then smooth muscles found in internal organs and other internal structures. Finally, this is here just to give you a sense of where all of the skeletal muscles are located in your body and just exactly how many muscles you have. You certainly don't need to memorize all of these or even any of them. This is meant just to give you a rough idea of what your musculature looks like.